the house on Birchwood Lane, the truck I'd driven for 11 years, and the landscaping business I'd spent 3 decades building, from nothing but a second-hand mower and a bad back. That's what I walked away from the dinner table thinking about. Not the pot roast my daughter-in-law had barely touched. Not the way my son had laughed. That particular laugh, the one he'd learned sometime in the last 4 years that didn't sound like him at all. What I kept turning over in my mind, driving home through the dark on Route 9, was the exact moment I realized I had become invisible to my own son. Not invisible the way old men get invisible. Invisible the way furniture gets invisible. Something you walk past every day without seeing. He'd said it right there at the table, in front of my daughter-in-law, in front of her parents who were visiting from Scottsdale, in front of everyone. He'd said it like it was just a fact, the way you'd say the sky is blue or the creek runs north. Dad's always been more of a caretaker type. Not really a builder. Not really a builder. I am 63 years old. I have calluses on my hands that haven't softened since 1987. I have built things that are still standing. I said nothing. I picked up my fork and I finished my meal and I drove home. By Thursday of the following week, my son no longer had a business partner. His wife no longer had her car note covered, and the man he'd spent 4 years trying to become, my son-in-law, the one who'd given him that laugh, was sitting in a very expensive rental house he could no longer afford, making calls nobody was going to answer. My name is Hugh Callister. I am 63 years old, and I have learned, late in life, that silence has more than one use. The dinner was at my son's house in West Haven. He and his wife had moved there 2 years ago, into a neighborhood with a homeowners association and a gate that required a code. I remembered when he was proud of the apartment he rented at 24 because it had a dishwasher. People change. I know that. I didn't hold the gate against him. What I held against him was harder to name, and it had been building for years. My son is 36. He married his wife, a woman I'll call my daughter-in-law because that's what she is, whatever she thinks of me, 6 years ago. She came with opinions and a father who'd made money in commercial real estate, and somewhere in those 6 years, my son had become a different version of himself. Not worse, exactly, just shaped by different hands. Her father is the one I'll call my son-in-law's father-in-law, though the important thing to understand about him is that he sees himself as a man who rescues situations. Every room he walks into, he's looking for the problem he can solve out loud, in front of witnesses. He found his way into my son's life about 3 years ago, when he started talking about what my son could be doing with his career, and my son started listening. Before that, my son worked for me, not because I made him, because he wanted to. We'd spent 8 years building Callister Grounds together, and I don't say that to make it sound like more than it was. It was a landscaping and property maintenance company. We did residential, some light commercial, HOA contracts. At our peak, we had 14 employees, 2 trucks, and a reputation in 4 counties that I was genuinely proud of. My son handled the scheduling and the bids. I handled the crews and the work. We were, I thought, a team. Then his wife's father started taking him to lunch. The first sign was when my son started talking about scaling. The second sign was when he stopped showing up on job sites. The third sign, the one I should have paid more attention to, was when he stopped asking my opinion on anything. Her father had convinced him that what we had was small. That small was fine for me, but that my son was capable of something larger. That the reason we hadn't grown faster was my approach. Careful, methodical, debt-averse. Old-fashioned was the word I heard once through a doorway I wasn't supposed to be standing near. I didn't fight it. I told myself it was generational. I told myself my son had the right to have ambitions that didn't look like mine. I restructured the business quietly so that he could have more autonomy, more ownership on paper. I co-signed things I didn't need to co-sign. I made introductions and stepped back and said nothing when credit didn't come my way. I told myself I was being a good father. What I was actually doing was building something my son would one day call his own, while never quite noticing whose name was on the foundation. The dinner in West Haven started early, because her parents were there, and they kept to a strict schedule. Her father grilled steaks on a built-in outdoor kitchen that probably cost more than my first house. He grilled them well. I'll give him that. He was the kind of man who filled every silence before it had a chance to breathe. That night he was talking about a deal he'd put together in Phoenix, a strip mall acquisition, Something about cap rates and triple net leases. My son was nodding the way he'd once nodded at his football coach. Alert. Eager. Wanting to get it right. I watched my daughter-in-law watch her father, and I understood that in her mind, that was what authority looked like. Not the kind my hands knew, the other kind. Her mother asked me how retirement was treating me. I wasn't retired. I was still working, still running 3 crews, still up at 5 in the morning most days of the week. I said that fine, and let it go. Then her father turned to my son and said, loud enough that the whole patio could hear, "You've got the instincts, son. What you needed was someone to show you the bigger picture." He looked at me briefly. The way you look at a piece of furniture you're considering donating. No offense to your dad's operation, of course. It's a solid little business. Solid little business. My son smiled. It was the smile of someone who'd already decided which table he was sitting at. "I've been thinking," my son said, and he said it to everyone but me. "I want to restructure the whole thing. I think with the right capital injection and a regional expansion strategy, we could be looking at a totally different company in 5 years." The right capital injection. 5 years ago he didn't know what cap rates meant either. "Who's the we in that?" I asked. I kept my voice even. He looked at me then. "The business, Dad. Me and you, obviously." But the way he said obviously told me it wasn't obvious at all. Her father leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man watching chess pieces move the way he'd planned. "Hugh," he said, "your son's got vision. The question is whether you're ready to let go of the wheel a little." I took a bite of steak. It was perfectly cooked. I tasted nothing. The conversation moved on. My son talked about his expansion plans. His wife contributed details about branding and social media presence. Her mother asked about square footage. Her father quoted numbers I was supposed to be impressed by. I sat there and I thought about the 14 people who worked for me, and whether any of them knew that the man sitting at this table had just been told by his own son, in everything but exact words, that he was the thing holding them back. And then, as the dessert plates were being cleared, my son said it. He was telling a story about a pitch he'd given to a commercial property manager. The manager had asked about the company's growth history, and my son was explaining how he'd handled it. "I basically told him that the old model was very caretaker-oriented," he said. "Very maintenance-focused. Which is fine, that's what Dad built, and it served its purpose. But I'm building something different now, a real company." He didn't look at me when he said it. Her father nodded. "That's exactly the right framing. A real company. I had 32 years in that business. I had payroll records going back to 1994. I had 11 employees who'd been with me for more than a decade, who had mortgages and kids in school and health insurance through my plan. I had a line of commercial contracts that paid consistently, a reputation that had taken 2 generations of referrals to build, and a balance sheet that had never once been in the red. But I hadn't built a real company. I set my napkin on the table. I said I appreciated the dinner. I hugged my daughter-in-law. I shook her father's hand. I looked at my son for a moment, and he looked back, and I saw in his face something that broke something in me very quietly. He wasn't embarrassed. He was comfortable. This was just how things were now. I drove home. I did not go to bed for a long time. I have a law school friend I've known for 35 years. He practices in Knoxville. Corporate and estate law, the kind that runs very quietly and leaves very little visible from the outside. His name doesn't matter. But what matters is that he has known me since, before I had a business, before I had a son, and he has helped me structure things over the years in ways that I never fully explained to anyone else, including my son. I called him the next morning, early, he answered, because that is the kind of friend he is. "I need to walk through the structure," I said. "All of it." There was a pause. "How long have you been thinking about this?" "Since about 11 o'clock last night." He was quiet for a moment. "All right. Come by the office Thursday. I'll have Morel clear my afternoon." I spent the next 3 days going through files I hadn't opened in years. Not because I'd forgotten what was in them. I knew exactly what was in them. But because I wanted to see it laid out clearly, the way you lay out tools before a job, so you don't waste time during. What my son knew about Callister Grounds was this, that it was a family business, that he was the operations manager, that he had a 30% equity stake that I'd transferred to him 4 years ago as a gesture of partnership. What my son did not know, what no one had thought to tell him, because no one had thought it would ever matter, was how the rest of the structure worked. The business had been reorganized 8 years ago under a holding LLC. The holding company owned the contracts, the equipment, the client relationships, the name. My son's 30% was in the operating entity, the part that did the work, the part that was only worth anything as long as the holding company kept the contracts flowing to it. The holding company was mine, entirely, quietly on paper that my son had never asked to read. There was also the matter of his truck. He drove a company truck, a good one, a diesel F-350 that he loved and that I had purchased through the business 3 years ago as a capital asset. He'd started treating it as his personal vehicle, the same way he'd started treating the company as his personal project. Gradually, then completely. The truck was registered to the holding LLC. He was listed as an authorized operator, the same way a company car works, except that he had stopped thinking of it that way. And then there was the last piece. My son had been courting a large regional contract for about 8 months, a home builder out of Chattanooga with 15 active developments. He'd told me about it early on, excited, running the numbers out loud. I'd listened and said it sounded promising. What I hadn't told him was that the primary contact at the home builder was a man I'd done work for 20 years ago, when he was a project manager on a subdivision outside of Maryville. A man who occasionally called me to check in. A man who, when the contract conversations had started, had called me first, and who had moved forward because I'd told him to. My son thought he'd won that contract on the strength of his pitch. He'd won it because his father made a phone call and didn't mention it. I spread all of this across my kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. I wasn't angry, exactly. The anger had burned off somewhere on Route 9 the night of the dinner. What was left was something cooler and more purposeful, a clarity. The same feeling I get at the start of a big job when everything is organized, and I know exactly what order to do things in. He'd called me a caretaker. He'd called what I built a little business. He'd said I wasn't a builder in front of people who didn't know any better, and he'd said it comfortably, the way you say something you've thought many times, and finally had permission to say out loud. I thought about my father, who had worked until his hands gave out, and who died without anyone outside his family knowing what he'd sacrificed. I thought about what it meant to build quietly, to put things in order and step back, and not need the credit. I had spent my whole life thinking that was virtue. Somewhere along the way, my son had learned to see it as weakness. I was going to show him the difference. My attorney had the same coffee ready that he always had when I came in on serious business. Black, in the kind of mug that's been washed 1,000 times. He's a man who has never needed to perform professionalism for me, which is exactly why I've trusted him for 3.5 decades. Walk me through what you want to happen, he said. So I did. I told him about the dinner. I told him what my son had said, the exact words, the comfortable way he'd said them. I told him about her father's expression when he said it. I told him about my daughter-in-law watching her father like he was a compass. My attorney listened. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he put his pen down. The holding structure gives you everything you need, he said. You can initiate a contract review, which triggers a 60-day operational audit under the LLC agreement. During the audit, all major expenditures require co-authorization. Your son's check-signing authority is subordinate to yours during that period. And the truck, asset of the holding LLC. You can recall it with 30 days written notice. The operator agreement has a standard business use clause. If you can document personal use in excess of the agreement terms. He raised an eyebrow. I nodded. There was plenty of documentation. 30 days? And the Chattanooga contract? He was quiet for a moment. That's the most significant piece. If the contract was facilitated through your personal relationship with the contact, it was then the renewal conversations happen with you, not with the operating entity. If you choose not to advocate for the renewal, the contact will likely reach out to you directly. At that point, it's your call whether that business stays in the company or goes elsewhere. I looked out his window at the parking lot below. A man was loading something into a pickup, just going about his day. I don't want to hurt the employees, I said. The 14 people who work for us, they have nothing to do with this. Then we structure it so the operational disruption is targeted. The contracts stay with the holding company. The employees stay employed. What changes is who's running the operating entity and under what terms. I nodded slowly. One more thing, I said. Her father. He's been positioning himself as a business advisor. My son has been paying him for it through the company as a consulting line item. My attorney looked up. $2,000 a month, I said. For about 8 months. He wrote something down. That's an expenditure that would be flagged in any proper audit as potentially a related party transaction, especially without a formal engagement letter. There isn't one. Then it's unauthorized under the LLC operating agreement. He capped his pen. We have everything we need. I thanked him. I drove home. I planted my garden for 2 hours, which is what I do when I need to think without thinking. The tomatoes were coming in. The zucchini had gotten out of hand the way it always does. On the way back inside, I called the contact in Chattanooga. Just to check in, I said. Just to see how things were going. We talked for 40 minutes. He said he hoped whoever renewed the contract would have the same reliability my company had always had. He said dependability was the thing he valued most, and that in his experience, it was the hardest thing to find. I said I appreciated that. I said I'd be in touch. The week that followed was one of the quieter weeks of my life. Monday morning, my son arrived at the company office, a converted garage behind the main shop, to find his access card wasn't working on the filing system. He called the office manager, who told him there was a routine audit in progress and that the system had been locked down per the holding company's protocol. She was apologetic. She had no idea what it meant. He called me. I let it go to voicemail. Tuesday, the company truck, his truck, the one he'd started keeping in the driveway of his house in West Haven as though it had always belonged there, was picked up at 7 in the morning by a transport company I'd contracted. The operator agreement had been formally terminated. A notice had been sent to his email address the previous Friday. He hadn't opened it. He called me 4 times. I was pruning. By Wednesday, he'd reached his wife's father, who had started asking questions about the consulting arrangement. The office manager told him that all consulting contracts were under review and that payments had been temporarily suspended pending the audit. Her father called my son. My son called my attorney's office and was told politely that all inquiries should go through the holding company's designated representative, which was my attorney. I heard from my attorney that her father was not taking the news well. He'd structured his own finances, apparently, around that $2,000 monthly deposit ways that suggested he'd taken the arrangement for granted. There was a storage unit. There was a boat payment. There was a lease on a very nice car that my daughter-in-law's mother drove, all of it running on the assumption that the consulting income was permanent. It was not permanent. It had never been anything more than my son choosing to pay for advice that was costing us both more than money. Thursday evening, my son showed up at my house. He didn't knock. He walked around to the back, where I was sitting on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the light go off the ridge the way it does in late summer. He looked like he hadn't slept. His shirt was wrinkled. He stood at the edge of the porch steps and stared at me. "It's you," he said. "You're doing this." I looked at him. He looked the way he'd looked when he was 9 years old and had broken the garage window with a baseball and hadn't told me for 3 days. That same face. That same mixture of anger and the beginning of something else. Something under the anger that was harder to name. "Sit down," I said. He sat. I went inside and got him a glass of iced tea. He didn't ask for it, but his throat was working the way it does when a man is trying to decide whether to keep being angry or start being scared. "The truck," he said. "The system lockout. And now Carol," that was the office manager. "Carol's telling me she doesn't know when operations will resume normal authorization." "What does that mean? What is this?" "It means the company is being audited. You're auditing your own company. My holding company is auditing the operating entity, yes. That's normal procedure. It's in the LLC agreement. I've never even seen the LLC agreement." I looked at him steadily. "I know." The silence was long enough that the birds came back to the feeder at the edge of the porch. "I want to show you something," I said. I went inside and brought out a folder. Not a laptop. A folder, because I wanted him to hold the paper. "This is the structure of Callister Grounds," I said. "Not the part you see. The whole thing." I laid it out for him the way my attorney had laid it out for me. The holding company, the operating entity, the contract relationships, the equipment ownership. Page by page I set it in front of him, and I watched his face as he read. He didn't say anything for a long time. You own all of it, he said finally. I own the structure that makes the operating entity worth anything. Yes, my 30% is real, and it's worth something. But it's worth something because the holding company has been directing contracts, relationships, and infrastructure to the operating entity for 8 years. Without that, your 30% of the operating entity is 30% of a lawn care business with used equipment and no anchor contracts. He set the paper down. He picked it up again. Set it down. The Chattanooga contract, he said slowly. I let him work it out. You knew Harwick, he said. That was the contact's name. I've known him for 20 years. He called you first. Yes. He sat with that. Why didn't you tell me? Because you didn't ask. Because when you came home from that pitch meeting, you were so proud of yourself that I didn't have the heart to tell you it was already done. And then the weeks went by, and I kept not telling you, and eventually it just became the story, that you'd won it yourself. He looked at me. Did you not trust me to? I trusted you completely, I said. That's why I kept it running. The word ran quietly between us. Carolyn's father, he said. The consulting arrangement. $2,000 a month for 8 months. No engagement letter. No deliverables on paper. Just a line item that went through without authorization review because you signed the checks. He closed his eyes. He told me it was normal, my son said. He said all growing businesses had advisory relationships, that it was how you accessed networks you didn't have on your own. He made it sound. I know how he made it sound. I know what you think of him, but he's been in my corner, Dad. He's been telling me I have what it takes. You never. He stopped. What? He looked out at the ridge. The light was almost gone. You never said it like he did. You were always measured. You'd say that sounds promising, or let's think it through. He'd say you're going to be great. It felt different. I thought about that for a while. I said that sounds promising because I didn't want you to fall on your face and feel like I'd set you up for it, I said. I was measuring because I was protecting you. That's what I knew how to do. He didn't say anything. What he was doing, I said, was making you feel good so you'd keep paying him. $2,000 a month for telling you that you're great is not a corner man. That's a salesman. The night was coming in around us. My son sat with his elbows on his knees, looking at his hands. What happens now? He said. That depends on you. Meaning what? Meaning I'm not dismantling anything. The employees keep working. The contracts stay. The business stays open. But the conversation we had at that dinner table, the one where I'm a caretaker and not a builder, where what I spent 32 years doing was a little business that served its purpose, that conversation needs to be the last time that happens. He was quiet for a long time. I didn't mean it the way it came out. You meant some of it. He didn't deny it. That was the moment I knew we might actually get somewhere. He exhaled. I've been trying to be a different kind of man than you. I love you, but I didn't want to be you. I didn't want to be the guy nobody sees. And he made it sound like there was a path to being the other kind, the visible kind. And now? He picked up the ownership diagram again. He looked at it for a moment, really looked at it, I think, for the first time. You've been visible the whole time, he said quietly. I just wasn't looking at the right things. I didn't say anything. Sometimes you don't need to. I called Carolyn that night. I could hear her voice before she finished saying hello. Tight, controlled, the voice of someone who's been managing a situation all day. Is this about Daddy's consulting? She said. Among other things. She was quiet. He's been very good to us, she said. He's been very good to your son. He's been paid for it, I said. Monthly. Out of the company. She paused. He said that was an investment in the business. An investment usually goes through an agreement. There wasn't one, but that's a separate matter. I let a moment pass. I want to talk about your son. And there it was. The opening I'd been building toward. The conversation no one else had thought to have with her. I told her that her son had real ability, that I had always believed that the instincts were good and the work ethic was genuine. What he'd been missing was not confidence. He had plenty of that, some of it misplaced. What he'd been missing was a clear sense of where the ground actually was, what was his and what wasn't, what he'd built and what he'd inherited. That's not a small thing to know about yourself. It might be the most important thing. She listened. I don't know if she agreed. I don't know if she'll agree this week or this year. But she listened and she didn't hang up. And when the call ended, she said she appreciated me calling. I sat on the porch a while longer after that. The stars were out. The summer air had that particular thickness that settles in after dark, heavier than the daytime, quieter. The tomatoes needed staking. The zucchini was definitely going to have to go. I thought about my father, who had worked a Cole County hardware store for 40 years, and who left me, when he died, not money exactly, but a set of values about what you owe people, and what you don't, and what it means to build something that outlasts you. He never once asked to be recognized. He would have found the whole concept uncomfortable. I had spent my life trying to be that, trying to be someone who didn't need the credit, who did the work and stepped back. But there's a cost to that too. A cost you don't always see until someone who should know better looks right at you and says, out loud, that you're not really a builder. What I've learned, what it took me until 63 to understand, is that the real work isn't done in silence, and it isn't done in noise. It's done by someone who knows exactly what he's built and isn't afraid anymore to let other people know it. Not for the credit, not to prove something, just so the record is accurate. The business is still running. My son still comes to work. Her father's consulting contract was not renewed, and if he'd like to contest that, my attorney's number is on the holding company's public filing. My son asked me, about 2 weeks after that night on the porch, if I would go over the full LLC agreement with him. We spent 4 hours on it. He asked good questions. He took notes. He still has his 30%. I still have everything else. But more than that, more than the structure and the contracts and the Chattanooga account, I have the thing I didn't know I'd lost until the night I drove home on Route 9 in the dark, wondering when I became furniture. I have the clear knowledge of what I built and what it's worth. That's not nothing. For a caretaker, that's actually quite a lot.